you so much, Hafsa. And I want to echo what you just said. I was very moved by the tremendously powerful remarks of Mirai and our first speaker. And really, I'm the one who's honored to be on such a distinguished panel. As Hafsa said, just 2 days ago, we were together in Washington, D.C., when the Lantos Foundation presented our highest honor to Enes Kanter Freedom, somebody who I think has really been an example to so many of us of using one's platform, using one's position and fame and reach, whatever that may be, to speak out not only on behalf of one's own community, but on behalf of people who are persecuted everywhere in the world. And we were really so proud to be able to honor this remarkable Turkish leader and voice. And I really believe that in the coming years, as he is involuntarily sort of retired from his career as a star basketball player, that he will continue to emerge more and more as a leading voice in the human rights movement, and somebody from from Turkey who can really speak with great power about these issues, and someone also from the Gülen movement. So we're talking on this panel about the issue of arbitrary detention. And this topic, in my opinion, underscores the absolute centrality of the rule of law to any society that hopes to achieve even the most basic respect for fundamental human rights. Of course, autocratic and repressive regimes routinely violate fundamental human rights and routinely engage in a pattern of arbitrary and wrongful detention. But they all want to maintain a sort of superficial patina of legitimacy. And so they pervert and twist their laws, or they adopt new ones, or they expand unreasonably old ones, so that their wholesale persecution of entire communities, as we've seen with, of course, the Kurds, which has just been addressed by our previous speaker, and very recently, certainly since the so-called coup in 2014, we have seen that wholesale persecution targeting the Gülen movement as well. And they do it both for entire communities as well as specific targeting of individuals. Both of these things have happened in Turkey on a massive scale. But as I say, they try to maintain this sort of faint veneer, if you will, of plausibility. And so they deploy laws to effectuate this wide-scale persecution. Although at the end of the day, no one is really fooled. One common example of this practice is to use so-called anti-terror laws to delegitimize free speech, to delegitimize movements that are seeking simply to validate their own fundamental human rights. And there are very few governments that can equal the Erdogan government in terms of deploying this kind of anti-terror strategy on a massive and really completely illegitimate scale. As I say, it's been deployed against the Kurds, it's been deployed against the Hizmet movement and many others. We have seen the same tactic utilized, of course, by the Chinese against the Uyghur community. And I want to be very sort of humble, I guess, as an American, in acknowledging that certainly in our early history, we saw this same pattern. Our second president, President John Adams, adopted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which he used as a weapon against those who were merely critics or political opponents. Our most revered and most admired, and in my opinion, our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, during the midst of our Civil War, which was admittedly a time of great danger for our country, but constitutional scholars looking back acknowledge that he also deployed this same flawed law, the Alien and Sedition Acts, to target those who were merely critics during the Civil War and not actually traitors to their country. And I think, again, as Americans who treasure the rule of law and who treasure our efforts as a rule of law country to adhere to the rule of law, look back on some elements of the Patriot Act, which was adopted in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And we see there too an overreach, an attempt to sort of harness law, not in the pursuit of legal means, but in an overreaching effort to target certain communities. Now, one of the things that I think we in the United States can feel very good about is that we do have a robust rule of law system. We have an independent judiciary. And so although the wheels of justice often turn somewhat slowly, over time, these overreaches and these abuses of the rule of law are usually corrected through our legal system. And I teach a course on human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University. And I talk about how those targeted in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks were eventually able to overturn unjust acts that had been taken against them, and were able to use our own Constitution to do so. Now, this fight against arbitrary detention really figures in what many think of as the very beginning of any semblance of a human rights movement that we, from our modern perspective, can relate to. It really began in the Western tradition, at least, with the Magna Carta. Some of you may have studied the Magna Carta in your legal studies or in your history studies, but that was sort of the first time in Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence that elements banded together. They were nobles at that time, but they banded together to restrain the untrammeled power of the monarch in England. And one of the most important elements of the Magna Carta was something that is sometimes called the Great Writ in English common law. Now, the Great Writ is the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus comes from a Latin phrase, which means you shall have the body or show us the body. And it was very specifically intended to protect people against just what we see happening in Turkey today, namely unlawful, arbitrary detention and imprisonment without a proper legal basis. And that writ of habeas corpus was intended to give anyone who was taken into custody by, at that time, the king, the right to go before a magistrate, to go before a judge, and require that judge to demonstrate that there was a legal basis for holding that individual. Such a powerful, powerful tool against precisely what we see happening on such a massive scale in Turkey. It really is the foundational guarantee against abuse at the hands of government, and it provides some modicum of due process for somebody so targeted under law. Now, clearly, in Turkey today, these fundamental protections are being ignored, are being trampled upon. But there is value in speaking out. There is value in shining a light on those abuses, in holding the government of Turkey, the government of Erdogan, up to international scrutiny and condemnation for its violation of these most fundamental principles. We know that in any individual case, it may be difficult to vindicate our internationally guaranteed rights. But standing up for them, speaking out about them, not letting the abusers get away, not letting them claim a false legitimacy is incredibly important. And I'd like, if I may, to share with you some very powerful words about the importance of sustaining the rule of law that come from my one of my favorite works of literature. I'm a lawyer by training, and I often say when I speak to law students or lawyers that I feel that this particular work of literature really should be required reading in every law school. It's a very famous play called A Man for All Seasons. Some of you may have heard of it. I'm actually going to give all of you an assignment. I'm sure that it has been translated both into Kurdish and Turkish. But it's a really quite brilliant play, which tells the story of Sir Thomas More, who was one of the most powerful men in England during the reign of Henry VIII. Henry VIII is most known and remembered for having had 6 wives, many of whom met a very unfortunate fate. A lot of them were beheaded, and he has become one of the, as I say, most colorful and notorious figures in history for that reason. And if any of you are fans of the theater, there's now a very witty and clever new Broadway musical, or I should say it came from England. It's now playing all over the world, called Six, which tells the story of the 6 wives of Henry VIII. But as I say, Sir Thomas More was one of the most in all of England, but he was also a devout Catholic. And when Henry VIII fell in love with a young woman, Anne Boleyn, and wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine, and could not receive permission from the Pope to do so, to annul that first marriage, because of course divorce wasn't contemplated, but they had not his wife had not been able to produce a male heir, and he wanted to annul that marriage and marry this young woman. And Sir Thomas More, because of his conscience convictions, could not go along with this scheme. And so he resigned his very powerful office as the Lord Chancellor of England and intended to retire to a private life, because he knew the nature and character of Henry VIII and that he could not stand to be opposed in any matter. But so he made this decision: I'm going to retire from the public arena, and perhaps then I can live out my life in peace. But you know, when you are a person of conscience, and certainly so many tens of thousands of members of the Hizmet movement have faced this reality in their lives today in Turkey, those who have no conscience, those who trample on fundamental human rights, really can't leave you in peace, because to leave you in peace is to sort of, in some way, acknowledge their own violation of those same rights. So the little passage I'm going to read to you comes from a relatively early part in this dramatic story, where Sir Thomas More, having retired to his estate in the countryside, is visited by a very ambitious young man by the name of Richard Rich, who wants to be employed by Thomas. And Thomas recognizes that he is not a trustworthy individual, and that he may, in fact, be coming to spy on Sir Thomas to provide evidence that he can give to those who wish him ill, to those who are doing the dirty work, if you will, of Henry VIII. So this man has come and left somewhat angry because Sir Thomas has declined to give him employment. And as this individual, Rich, leaves, both Sir Thomas's wife and his daughter and his future son-in-law are furious that he has let him go. And they say, as he leaves, they are engaged in a conversation, and they say, his future son-in-law says to Sir Thomas, "Arrest him." And More says, "For what?" They say, "Well, for libel. He's a spy." And the others chime in, "He is. Arrest him, father. That man is bad." And Sir Thomas More says, "Well, there's no law against that." And his son-in-law responds, "Oh, there is, God's law." And Sir Thomas More responds, "Well, then God can arrest him." And they laugh and they say, sophistication upon sophistication. And Sir Thomas More responds, he says, no, it's sheer simplicity. The law. I know what's legal, and I'll stick to what's legal. So then his future son-in-law says, then you set man's law above God's? To which Sir Thomas More responds, no, far below. But let me draw your attention to a fact. I am not God. The currents and the eddies of right and wrong, which you find such plain sailing, I can't navigate. I'm no voyager. But in the thickets of the law, oh, there I'm a forester. I doubt if there's a man alive who could follow me there, thank God. And then his wife jumps in and she says, and while you talk, he's gone. And More responds, and go he should, if he was the devil himself, until he broke the law. So the son-in-law then says, so now you would give the devil benefit of the law? And More responds, yes. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil? And Roper says, I'd cut down every law in England to do that. And here is the critical passage. Sir Thomas More says, oh, and when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, Roper, the laws all being flat? This country is planted thick with laws, from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Yes, I'd give the devil benefit of law for my own safety's sake. It's a very, very powerful defense of the importance of those laws, international laws, laws of each of our countries that have been enacted to protect the rights of each of us. And of course, it is precisely the dictators who cut down those laws or distort them beyond recognition to achieve their evil purposes. But those of us who believe in human rights, who believe in the fundamental rule of law, we cannot abandon those laws. We have to continue to hold up the promise of the rule of law, even when those in power trample upon that fundamental principle. And I do believe, my father used to say that time heals all wounds and wounds all heals. And I do believe that that arc of justice is long, but the arc of history is long. But as Martin Luther King Jr. said, it bends towards justice. And so I'd like to close my brief remarks today by saying that we know the truth about the Erdogan regime, and that arc of history, which bends ultimately towards justice, will hold him accountable. But those of us who believe in the rule of law, who believe that in the long run it will prevail, we must stay true to those convictions, and we must continue through international mechanisms, the UN Working Group Against Arbitrary Detention, the International Court of Justice. We must continue to fight against the trampoline of the rule of law that we see on the part of the Erdogan regime. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today and to be part of such a distinguished panel.